Okay, so good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the day 3 of this school come workshop on data analysis in cosmology and astroparticle physics, organized by Technology Innovation Hub of Indian Statistical Institute. Although this is day 3, technically this is day 2, so to say, because yesterday we had a day off. And so before I hand it over to the speaker today, a couple of small announcements, which we have been doing several times in this program. Please keep yourself muted throughout the program. If you have any question, you can type that in the chat box, or if the speaker wants, you can also ask the question during the talk as well. So it's absolutely up to the speaker to take up the questions, whether he will take up during the program or at the end of the program. Okay. So this is number one. Number two is that for some of you, I mean, we are noticing that your voices are breaking during the question answer session. So please, take care of that. If you see that your voice is breaking, you should type your question in the chat box, and then maybe that will be taken care of. And okay, so that's all about today. And also, please try to join at least 10 minutes prior to the program so that we can begin in time. Today we had to begin it 2-3 minutes late. So we hope that we'll be able to begin that in time in the next sessions. Okay. So we are very fortunate to have among us Professor Tirthankar Raichaudhuri as a speaker today. He is a faculty member at NCRA TIFR in Pune. He works primarily on 21 centimeter cosmology as well as on large scale structure, dark matter, dark energy, and many more. So he has been a member of Square Kilometer Array India Consortium as the chair of science subcommittee as well as in other capacities as well. So he'll be talking mostly on large scale structure today, and then maybe after a couple of days, he'll be taking up on 21 centimeter cosmology. So very welcome to all of you and to the speaker as well. And now, Tit, the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you, Supratik, for the kind introduction, and welcome you all. So the plan for my lectures is that I will take 3 lectures like this and 2 hands-on sessions. So that is how I have planned the whole course. Now the first lecture is today, where I wanted to tell a bit about perturbed universe. So these are things which are kind of introductory material, which will be kind of useful for you in general. And I mean, of course, it will be useful for my course. Now, this subject is like quite broad. So, I mean, it's not possible to cover everything in full details in just 1.5 hours. So my idea would be to give you a kind of broad flavor of how people kind of study the perturbations in the universe, the inhomogeneities in the universe. So let's just go and start the discussion. So our universe is quite inhomogeneous. You would have learnt about the Friedman model in your courses somewhere, or even maybe on the first day of this school. But what you should realize is that the universe is only homogeneous, that too statistically only at large scales. If you will look at the universe at any time, it will show lots of structure. I will give you 2 examples which we observe in our universe. First is the CMB. The CMB is, actually looks very isotropic. It's hitting us from all sides. And if you correct for our local motion, you will find that the CMB temperature, no matter in which direction you look, is the same in all directions. But if you now look a bit closely with a very sensitive telescope and a reasonably high resolution, what you will see will look like this. You will see a lot of fluctuations on top of that very nice homogeneous isotropic background. So these in fact show that our universe do contain inhomogeneities, and these are the earliest signatures of inhomogeneities we see in our universe. The level of this inhomogeneity in temperature units is few tens of microkelvins. Since the CMB temperature is 3 Kelvin of that order, we are talking about inhomogeneities that are 1 part in 10 to the 5. Okay, so it's really, really small. So if you just look at the CMB using a very crude telescope like what was done initially, like for example, what Penzias and Wilson were doing, you won't see them. You really need very sensitive telescopes to do that, and that was done by later generations of satellites like COBE, then WMAP, and then Planck, and then also various balloon-based experiments. You will, I'm sure, learn about CMB in this school from others. I will give you another example. That is not CMB, but that's galaxies. So what we can do is we can go and try to observe galaxies, somewhat distant galaxies in our universe. And then depending on how sensitive these telescopes are, we are like continuously like breaking the barrier. We are actually observing galaxies to larger and larger distances. That means earlier and earlier in time, which also means higher and higher in redshifts. Okay, so I'm sure all of you are now comfortable with age of the universe versus redshift versus distance and things like that. Now, by the way, I forgot to tell you, if you have any questions, just stop me and ask. You don't have to wait till the end. Okay, so feel free to ask questions at any point. So, this picture actually, each point here shows a galaxy that is observed. Okay. This part, I mean, along this axis, it's the distance from us. And what you are seeing is basically a slice on the sky. Okay. And if you look at the galaxy distribution now, we see that they're not like uniform or random or anything. There are nice structures here. We see that the galaxies are kind of distributed in filaments, kind of walls and filaments here, and then there are places which are voids, where there are almost no galaxies. So this whole thing, this connection of filaments, sheets, and voids are popularly known as cosmic web. So clearly the universe has a lot of structure, and one kind of task of the Big Bang cosmology is to explain this large-scale structure. A lot of effort is being spent on it, both in observations as well as in theory. So now suppose you want to describe this. First, let us think about what kind of mathematical tools you will need to do that. So basically, the most accurate thing would be to do a perturbation which is relativistic, because you would have seen that if you want to describe the universe, you will use general theory of relativity, which is a relativistic theory. And using that, you will get equations which will tell you how the universe is expanding, depending on what kind of matter or energy components there exist in the universe. So that is the smooth component part, but we need to introduce inhomogeneities on top of the smooth background. So the basic idea would be that you take the unperturbed, the smooth metric, Gij, which for most cases will be the standard FRW metric. But on top of that, you will use perturbations. So the total metric will be the standard FRW metrics plus some perturbations. This will clearly lead to Einstein tensor, which will be the standard Einstein tensor plus some perturbation part. And clearly, if the curvature, if the space-time geometry is getting perturbed, it must be sourced by matter which is also perturbed. So in the matter part, you will have this homogeneous and isotropic matter, whatever rho minus p minus p minus p, or whatever you have learned till now. But on top of that, you will have a component which has spatial dependence. Okay, so it's not homogeneous anymore. Now what you will do is you will equate this Gij to this new Tij. Now Gij bar and Tij bar, if you equate these two, I mean with your 8 pi g and other things put in, that part will lead to the standard Friedmann equations for the smooth universe. What you will be left with is the perturbed part. And these equations then can be used for studying the evolution of perturbations. The basic idea is very simple, but implementing it is very difficult, mainly because, as you know, the Einstein equations are highly nonlinear. Okay, so solving them in its full generality is very tough. In FRW metric, it becomes easier because of the symmetries you have. Okay, so because it's a maximally symmetric space, you are talking about homogeneous and homogeneity and isotropy. So that is why it becomes simpler, very simple, not here. Of course, in some cases, things can be much easier to deal with. For example, if the amplitude of the perturbations are very small, then you can use linear perturbation theory. So although the full equations could be non-linear, what you will do is you will ignore the higher order terms, retain only the linear part. And then, of course, the problem becomes tractable. In fact, this is precisely what is done for working out the CMB perturbations. In CMB perturbations, you have to do relativistic perturbation theory. But since the perturbations are very small, 1 part in 10 to the 5, we just talked about that, you can do linear perturbation theory. And the mathematics is very elegant and you can solve for everything. You may have to do some numerical analysis, but it is tractable at least. However, the moment the perturbations becomes kind of approaches kind of unity, just doing it with linear theory may not be valid. And then doing it using relativistic theory becomes almost impossible. Now it turns out that most of the structure formation we are interested in, like formation of these galaxies, this cosmic web, which I just showed you in the previous slide, there it is sufficient to work with Newtonian equations. You really don't need to do relativistic perturbation theory. Of course, with Newtonian equations, the things simplify drastically, but even that is very difficult to track. And that is something I'm going to talk about in the next few slides. So let us think about this Newtonian theory, the Newtonian equations. So the validity of Newtonian equations will be only for scales which are much smaller than the horizon size or the Hubble radius, whatever you call it. And that is basically of the order of c divided by the Hubble parameter at that redshift. So if you are interested in scales which are much smaller than this, you can use Newtonian theory. Of course, you will also have to ensure that the kind of fluids you are talking about must be non-relativistic. So for example, if you now want to study perturbation in radiation, then again Newtonian equations will be slightly difficult to deal with. Okay, so you have to be careful there as well. Now, most of these galaxy formation and large scale structure which we see are actually happening at scales much smaller than this. So Newtonian perturbation theory works for most cases. Okay? There could be cases where you still need to go to relativistic perturbation theory, but those things are rare and we don't have to worry about them now. Of course, again, if you have done your homogeneous and isotropic Friedmann model, you know that we treat all the cosmic matter as fluids, at least at scales, at the cosmic scales. So basically what you can do is you can write the equations for fluid dynamics, the non-relativistic equation for fluid dynamics, and that will be the starting point. And what are these equations? These equations, again, some of you would have done some fluid mechanics, but let me just describe these equations without going into the derivation or anything. The first equation, which talks about rho dot, so let me just complete the slide here. So the first equation, which is rho dot plus divergence of rho times u, where u is the velocity, this thing equal to 0. This is nothing but the mass conservation. Okay, so this is known as the continuity equation. So if at some place, if you want to change the density, that has to be associated with matter flowing out or flowing in. Okay, depending on whether you want to increase or decrease the density. So that is the continuity equation. A similar equation you would have done while studying, for example, Maxwell's equations. Okay, that would be the charge conservation. But in this case, we are talking about total matter conservation. The second equation, which involves a u dot, the time derivative of the velocity, and then a u dot del operating on u. This basically you will realize is nothing but the total time derivative of the velocity vector. So this is like the acceleration on the left hand side. And this acceleration of these fluid elements are driven by the forces acting on it. The forces can come from gravity. So this is the grad phi, the gravitational force acting on that with a minus sign. Okay, so this is again something we all know. And there could be some force coming from the pressure. Okay, so if there are pressure acting on the fluid, that will also play a role. Yeah. This is known as the Euler equation. These two equations, if you now are thinking about the relativistic part, these two are nothing but the conservation equations in the non-relativistic limit. You remember the conservation equation, Ti, the covariant derivative of Tij with respect to xj equal to 0. If you just take the non-relativistic or the Newtonian limit of that, you will get this continuity equation and Euler equation. So if you are interested in how these equations come from the relativistic part, but you can also derive these things just from the Newtonian mechanics. So that's also fine. You will get the same equations, of course. The third equation tells you what is the gravitational field given the density of matter. That's nothing but a Poisson equation. This would be equivalent of the Einstein equations. Okay, non-relativistic limit of the Einstein equations. Good. So this is the fluid equation, and this will be the starting point of what we are going to do next. Now, these equations can be simplified by just doing some change of variables. So the first one is, instead of working with the actual coordinate, we can go to what is known as the co-moving coordinate. So if the actual coordinate is r, you can define a co-moving coordinate, which is like r equal to a times x. A is nothing but the scale factor of the universe. So basically, if you think of what we call as co-moving observers or fundamental observers, observers are like particles which are just moving with the Hubble flow, no perturbation, nothing. They are just expanding like the universe expands. For those kind of particles, x will not change. Why? Because the distance between them have to increase by as a, right? That is what you have learned in the expanding universe model. So for those cases, x would not change. So any change in x would actually tell you that there is extra motion over and above the standard Hubble expansion in the universe. So that is why going to x helps. Okay, so x will, any change in x or any derivatives or whatever we do with x will have to do with perturbations. Okay, if the universe was strictly speaking completely homogeneous and isotropic, no perturbations, nothing, then x would not change for any observer or any particle. We can also, what we can do is we can define some few new quantities which will, where we kind of try to subtract out the unperturbed part. So suppose you have the density, which now depends on both time and x. You divide by the smooth part of the density. Smooth part of the density is nothing but that quantity which sits on the right hand side of your Friedmann equations. Okay? So you divide by that and subtract 1. You will get a dimensionless quantity. This is called the density contrast. You can see, again, if the universe was completely homogeneous, then rho at every position would be exactly equal to rho bar, and delta would be 0. So density contrast, any deviation of density contrast from 0 is actually telling us about perturbations. Okay? If the density contrast is very small, that would be like very small perturbations. That will be like what we see in CMB. And as the universe evolves, more structures form, the delta increases. Similarly, you can define a peculiar velocity field, which is nothing but a times dx dt. And you can also see that that is nothing but the total velocity minus a dot by ar. Now this a dot by ar is nothing but the Hubble expansion part. So if everything was expanding like the Hubble's law, or the Hubble-Lemaitre law now it's called, you would have the velocity would be just a dot by a times r. Now, the peculiar velocity field is nothing but the total velocity, the difference between the total velocity and the Hubble flow. So again, if you see, if the universe was completely homogeneous and isotropic, the peculiar velocity field would have been 0. Everything would be expanding like the Hubble Hubble-Lemaître law. Okay. So this will talk about, so this peculiar velocity field is telling us about perturbation. And similarly, you can talk about part of pressure, part of gravitational field, and so on. Now, what you can do is you can rewrite the equations in terms of these perturbed quantities. Of course, you have to subtract out the zeroth order on perturbed part. That will actually give you the Friedmann equation. So that's, you should check that that's indeed the case. And what you end up are these equations. Okay, so these are our old equations: the continuity equation, the Euler equation, and the Poisson equation. But in terms of first of all, the coordinate has been changed to x, and instead of rho and u and things like that, we are using the perturbed quantities, deltas and v's. For the moment, and actually for most of our lectures, we will ignore the complications arising from the gas physics that will affect the baryons. They occur at much smaller scales than we are interested in. So what we will do is we will treat as if the whole matter is like dark matter. Okay, it's collisionless gravitating matter. So we won't worry about the pressure term at all. The pressure term becomes important only for gas or baryons, so to speak, that too at small scales. So this is a simplification we are making. Again, just because we will be studying things at much larger scales. But even if you do that, you will see that these equations are still quite nonlinear. Okay, and it's not very easy to solve. What you can still do is to solve them analytically in the linear theory. So let's just do that, and we'll find that quite useful. If you go to the linear theory, what you will realize is that the equations simplify quite drastically. So if you look at the first equation, there is a term which has a delta and also a v. So the term which is delta times v will be second order in perturbation. So we will ignore that. So then we will be left with only divergence of v here. So that is what happens here. Similarly, this term, you see there are two v's appearing. So that is second order in perturbations. Ignore that. Okay. Pressure we have already said we will ignore. And what I've done is this rho bar I have written in terms of omega parameter. That's all. So you should be, all of you would be able to work these out. So these will be the equations in the linear approximation. Remember, these equations will be only valid when delta is much smaller than 1 and v is much smaller than 1 or less than c in this case. Okay. What you can do is you can manipulate this equation, and you can actually find that these set of equations can be reduced to one second order ordinary differential equation for delta, which looks like delta double dot plus 2a dot by a delta dot, and on the right hand side there is this delta term. Okay, many of you would find similarities with like forced damped harmonic oscillators, but except there is no restoring term here. But the full problem has a lot of similarities with harmonic oscillator problem mathematically. So again, if somebody is interested, you can ask me. Yeah.
Excuse me, sir. Sir, in the previous slide, you showed that first equation. You had average density for time average or position average. The third equation. In the first line.
Yes. Yeah. So these are position averaged. Okay, so time average, if I did time average, there won't be any dependence on time. Okay, so these are position average. So this quantity is only a function of time. This is, as I said, nothing but the quantity which sits on the right hand side of the Friedmann equation for the smooth universe.
Okay.
So it's only a time.
And the next slide. Okay, sir. And in the next slide, you have written rho average. Yeah, here.
Where
in the first line.
Yes.
Second
same
rho
bar as a function of time.
Okay, sir. Okay. Thank you.
This is the same rho bar. Okay. And that rho bar later I have converted into omega m, dividing by rho critical and things like that. Okay. So that will give you an extra factor of h naught square. Yeah. Now these equations are fine. Can we get some physical intuition from this?
Sorry to interrupt you, sir. Hello?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Sir, in the previous slide, it should be the part of gravitational field, but the main gravitational field should be only the function of time.
Okay, no, I didn't go into this. There is a bit of subtlety here. the mean gravitational field, if you take it to be only a function of time, then you will see that this delta r square of phi will be 0, and the right hand side you have to put it 0. Okay, so you will run into paradoxical situation. This has to do with the fact that the Newtonian equations, the Newtonian physics is not able to describe the completely homogeneous gravitational field. Okay, so this is some subtlety which you have to deal with here.
Thank you very much.
Excuse me, sorry to interrupt again. Hello.
Yeah.
Can you go to the previous slide?
Yes.
Yeah, so I understand the density contrast. Can you please tell me a bit more about the peculiar velocity field? What is it like?
Yes, the peculiar velocity field is the total field, total velocity, minus the Hubble flow. So if everything was expanding like the Hubble expansion, then the velocity of these fluid elements will be a dot by a times r. Okay. That is the Hubble law, Hubble-Lemaître law, in the non-relativistic limit, of course.
Yeah.
So the peculiar velocity field is telling you the deviation from the standard, this idealized Hubble flow. If everything was expanding with the Hubble flow, then this peculiar velocity field will be identically 0 everywhere. Okay, so that is why, in fact, it's called peculiar.
Yeah, okay.
So, for example, I mean, if you know, our closest galaxy is Andromeda. In fact, that is actually falling towards us.
Yeah.
And why is it falling towards us? Because the universe is expanding. It's falling because its peculiar velocity, I mean, has overcome the Hubble flow. It's so close, r is so small, that it is the gravity is pulling it towards us, or we are being pulled towards whatever it. Okay.
Yeah, there are other sources.
So it doesn't follow the Hubble's law there.
Yeah, like in small scales, like there are also other sources like great attractors.
Absolutely. So you can see, yeah, you will realize that as you go to larger and larger scales, this peculiar velocity field will tend to go to 0. Everything will become consistent with the Hubble flow. And that is why we say that at a large scale, the universe is homogeneous. Also at large scale, the density contrast will also tend to 0. Rho will tend to rho y.
But we still see a peculiar velocity of our observation frame with respect to the CMB, right?
That is our peculiar velocity.
Yeah, so that is like the resultant of all the components, like the
everything. Yeah. All gravity, I mean, whatever is doing to us. Okay, it could be Andromeda, it could be great attractor, it is our motion around the sun, sun's motion around the galaxy, everything. Okay, so that is telling us the velocity of us with respect to the CMB, the isotropic field. That's also peculiar velocity, our peculiar velocity.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Okay. Now, all these equations are fine. Can we get some physical intuition? And that's what I was coming to. So just for the moment, assume that we are in a static universe. Okay, this is just to give you some idea about what these equations mean. So a static universe, these equations can be reduced to equations for static universe if we just take a equals to 1 and put it to a constant. Okay, so we just don't let it evolve. So that will be the effect of static universe. So in this case, what will happen is this term will go to 0 and you can solve for this equation trivially. And the solution, I mean, you have to take some boundary initial conditions, and let's say the initial time derivative of the density contrast is 0. Okay, this is a simplified solution. You will find that delta will have two linearly independent solutions. One will be exponentially growing, another one will be exponentially like decreasing. Okay, damping. So what will happen is, as you wait for some time, this term will clearly go to 0 because it's going down quite fast. So you will remain, the only thing which will remain will be this exponentially increasing term. Okay? So what will happen is the density contrast will grow exponentially. That means the overdense points, the points which have density larger than the average density, delta greater than 0, will become more overdense. The underdense points which had average, which had density less than the average density, will become more underdense, okay, because your delta zero, depending on what its sign is, it will just grow. The amplitude will grow, but positive things will become more positive, negative things will become more negative. This is nothing but this is known as gravitational instability. This is easy to understand in a Newtonian framework. Suppose you have this density field, which is almost homogeneous, but it has very small perturbations. Okay, think of these perturbations as very small. It's almost close to the mean density everywhere. Now, places which are slightly overdense will have more like gravitational potential. So they will start attracting matter from the neighborhood. Okay, so this part has more matter than the neighborhood. So it will start attracting more matter. So the matter here will grow, hence the density here will grow. And clearly that matter will come from this underdense region. Okay, so this place will have less and less density, and so on. Okay, so overdense points will tend to grow in density, underdense points will kind of lose density, and at a later time it may look like this. And then if you keep on waiting for some more time, you will see that the overdense points have grown drastically, the underdense points have become kind of voids. Okay? So this is gravitational instability. If you make something slightly overdense, that part, the gravity will pick up and make it more and more overdense, and vice versa. And these equations, of course, show that. But clearly, of course, I mean, if you want to solve for the cosmological structure formation, you have to solve the full equations. Now, to solve the full equations, what you can do is you can do the simplest thing you can do is what we call the separation of variables, which you have all learned. So you take delta to be some function of t times some function of x, where x just depends on the.
Hello, sorry to interrupt. Can you go to the previous slide?
Yeah.
Yeah. Here you were showing the time evolution of the density field, right? So
yes,
like you said, the average. So here I can see the average is still the same after the evolution of time. But you said
that is how I have drawn. It doesn't matter what the average is.
Yeah, I mean the average will be the function of time, right? It's
Correct.
not like
it will go somewhere. That is why I didn't put any labels.
Okay,
Who told you that in these two plus these two dashed lines are at the same level?
Okay, got it. Thanks. Yeah.
So basically, if you do a separation of variables, what you will find, so what you can, yeah.
Sir,
Yeah,
in
go ahead.
the last plot,
Yes.
Can we interpret it as like Newtonian interpretation, like force is attracting everything towards its, where massive objects are attracting the other less massive objects, and in the gravitational, like Einstein fields, everything is like a gravitational field. And there are two different interpretations, right? So first one, this one is like Newtonian interpretation, like massive objects are pulling every less massive object towards each other, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's just that if you have places which have more matter, it will have more gravitational attractive force. Yes, that's all.
Yeah, okay.
So what happened?
Sorry, your voice is breaking. Whoever is speaking now, your voice is breaking. I cannot hear anything. Okay, let me move on. You can type in your question and I can try to answer towards the end. So as I said, you can do a separation of variables. You will be left with the equation for the time dependent part, which will be the same equation which delta satisfies. And then this is a simple linear second order differential equation, which will have two linearly independent solutions. And you will be able to show that only one of them is growing with time, the other one is decreasing with time. In particular, for the lambda CDM universe, the decaying solution is nothing but the Hubble parameter. It just turns out to be that. And the growing mode is given by this in terms of the Hubble parameter. Okay, this you can use your whatever you have learned in your mathematical physics course using Wronskians and things like that. For a flat matter-dominated universe, which is known as Einstein de Sitter universe, where lambda is equal to 0, in fact, the growing mode becomes just A. Okay, so if the universe expands by a factor of 2, in linear perturbations, all places the density contrast will grow by a factor of 2. Okay, so this is a very nice result which you find. Of course, when you put lambda, there is some correction on top of this. The general solution is clearly the growing mode times some f1x plus the decaying mode times some f2x. But the decaying mode is of no use in structure formation studies, because as you wait in time, the decaying mode will just die down because this part is decreasing. So we will be left with only the growing mode solution. That is the only one which is relevant for us. So we will just call this d1t as our dt. And whenever I write dt, it means the growing mode solution. The decaying mode solution plays almost no part in whatever we are going to discuss today. Usually dt is normalized such that it is unity at the present epoch. So if there were no lambda, dt would have been just a. It would have been 1 today and it would have been smaller earlier. Okay. Now, once you have solved for delta, you can go back to the linear equations and you can solve for all other quantities. For example, if you go to the Poisson equation, you will see that phi will evolve as d by a. And if you are talking about a matter-dominated universe, d is a, so phi does not evolve at all. Okay. So in the linear theory, in the matter-dominated universe, phi does not evolve. The gravitational potential does not evolve. It's a very interesting result. If you go to the continuity equation, you can find out how the peculiar velocity field evolves. The peculiar velocity field will evolve as a times d dot. Okay, because remember, there is a d delta dt or delta dot sitting in the continuity equation. But all these solutions are easily workable, but they are valid only for delta much less than 1. So that is something which is the limitation of linear perturbation theory. Suppose we want to go beyond linear perturbation theory, what you can do is, rather than jumping into full nonlinear case, you can try to see whether you can work out something for the moderately nonlinear, or what we call the quasi-linear cases, where delta is of the order of 1, maybe slightly greater than 1, but not much greater than 1. Okay, it hasn't become 100 or 1000. Okay, it's maybe 1, 5 of that order. Okay. So what you can do in that case is you take the linear theory. Linear theory, you said that v goes as a d dot. So you say that v, I will write it as a d dot times some function of x, because the time evolution is captured in a d dot, and I have to multiply by some psi of x, which will capture the spatial part. And the psi of x depends on the initial configuration of the field. Okay, it will depend because psi of x is not evolving. So whatever was the initial field setup, it will be that. But we also know, when we define the peculiar velocity, we'll go back and see that v is nothing but a dot x. So if you put it, what we will, a into x dot, v is a into x dot, and v is a d dot psi x. So that gives us x dot to be d dot psi in the linear regime, which has a solution which tells you x is the initial position plus d times psi, because x dot is d dot times psi. So this essentially tells you how the fluid elements are moving in the linear theory. Okay. Earlier, we just talked about the density field evolving. Now we are talking about how the fluid elements are moving. Again, if people have done fluid dynamics, you would have learned about Eulerian formalism and Lagrangian formalism. The earlier part, what we are doing was Eulerian. This is Lagrangian. But again, if you haven't done, don't worry about it. Just take it as whatever we are saying. Now, what Zeldovich, the Russian scientist, he said is that let us just take the initial configuration of the field and move the fluid elements using this, which is essentially coming from linear theory. But Zeldovich was able to show that this will work for cases where the density contrast has become nonlinear. Okay, so this was some insight Zeldovich had. Of course, this is an approximation. This is not a true solution, but it turns out that is a very good approximation. It really works. Okay. So what Zeldovich said is that you take the fluid elements and move using this formula. You will get solutions to a very, quite accurate, but you won't really can go to delta very high, but you can go to delta which are moderately nonlinear. Okay, so this is better than linear theory, but of course it cannot capture the full nonlinear theory. So you can think of this as the simplest way of running an n-body simulation. Okay, in fact, so if you ever think of writing an n-body simulation, you can start with writing a Zeldovich approximation code. Okay. Now you can ask what next, and of course there are a lot of ways to take it forward. As I said, the simplest way to evolve particle trajectories, what I mean by particle are these fluid elements, is via Zeldovich approximation, this is just extrapolation of the linear theory. You can actually do a bit more. You can actually work out higher order perturbations, order by order, and develop what is known as Lagrangian perturbation theory, where x is the initial position times terms. Okay, so there will be a term which will be d times psi q, the Zeldovich term. So it is, and then there will be another term which will be d square times some other psi. Okay, and that psi will be given by some complicated integrals of densities and so on and so on. Okay, you can build up the Lagrangian perturbations theory. So Zeldovich approximation will be the kind of first order Lagrangian perturbation theory. Then you can have second order perturbation theory. You can call it 2LPT. Then you can have 3LPT, 4LPT, whatever, depending on how much patience and computing power you have. You can go to higher order terms. Okay, and things will become more and more accurate as you go to higher and higher order terms. But there are a lot of subtleties here as well. Okay, so that's called the Lagrangian perturbation theory. But it is still like you are working perturbation term by term, and there is no guarantee that these series will converge. Okay, in all situations. If it converges, good. If it doesn't converge, then you have no choice but to actually run a full n-body simulation. And a full n-body simulation, you cannot do any of these very nice perturbation theory kind of a thing. What you have to do is you have to go and solve for the full trajectories. Although I haven't derived these equations, but it can be derived from the kind of equations we already wrote. In the full nonlinear case, you will be able to show that the particle trajectories evolve as this. See, in the normal Newtonian case, you know that x double dot will be minus grad of phi. The acceleration is just driven by gravity. But because of the expansion, there is this damping term, and you have to then appropriately account for the scale factor on the right hand side also. And then this has to be supplemented. You can ask, where will I get my phi from? Phi you will get from the particle positions themselves. Okay, so phi will come from the density, and the density will be given by the particle positions. So it becomes a very coupled set of equations, and that can in principle be solved. Okay, that is how people run n-body simulations, and that is how we study structure formation as of today. This actually gives you a flavor of how these things work. So what I have plotted here is a result from an n-body simulation. So n-body simulation run was completed, and then I have taken a slice from my 3D volume of that run, and I plotted that slice. Okay, so on the left hand side, I have plotted the result coming from the full nonlinear calculation, and you will be able to see this nice filaments and voids, that cosmic web coming out. In the middle panel, I have taken the same initial condition, but I haven't run an n-body. I have run a Zeldovich approximation code. You will see, I mean, if you look closely, there will be differences, but you see it captures the broad picture quite nicely. You can still see the filaments and voids. But if I go and look at it very in details quantitatively, you will find differences. Okay. Now, whether the differences are okay, you can live with it, will depend on the problem you are trying to solve. But what I'm trying to say is there are cases where Zeldovich approximation is a good approximation. Okay, so this is what it shows. The third panel actually shows what would have happened if I had evolved everything using linear theory. Even when the linear theory is not valid, I evolved using linear theory. You see, it doesn't work. This nice filaments are not captured here. You will also see that, okay, wherever there are high densities, the linear theory also gives high densities, but the structure is very different. The structures are very fluffy here, okay? It's just puffed up. It doesn't have these nice filaments and so on. So clearly linear theory breaks down much earlier. Zeldovich approximation works slightly better. In fact, 2LPT would have worked better than Zeldovich and so on. And this is the full simulation. For the rest of the class, what I will do is I will give you some flavors of how people try to solve for structure formation in simple cases. And one of these cases is the spherical collapse. What we can do is you can try to solve using spherical theory. So imagine there is a region which is overdense, but it is spherical. Okay, so this is a very idealized situation, but it has spherical symmetry. Now it turns out that in the case of spherical symmetry, you can solve the full nonlinear problem. You can solve it only because of the symmetry, okay? Because the equations become simple because of the spherical symmetry. Now, qualitatively, what we understand is that initially it will expand with the universe, but since it is overdense, at some point it will decouple from the expansion of the universe and it will start collapsing. Okay, so the radius will increase and then it will slow down and will start decreasing. Okay, and it will collapse. This is the physical picture which we are trying to capture. Now, how do we do that? We do that, we have to make some assumptions that there is a spherical region which can be thought of as like spherically concentric shells, and the mass content within these shells remain constant. In other words, the shells should not cross each other. Okay. In that case, you can again work out the equation of motion that will be satisfied by this radius of the shell. So it will be r double dot equal to minus gm by r square. This is not surprising. This is the simple Newtonian part. If there is a lambda, there will be a lambda term, okay, which will come as a positive one. Okay, so lambda term acts as kind of repulsive. Now, what happens is, for the kind of scales we are interested in, this lambda term becomes negligible, okay, because r is much smaller than the Hubble radius, and you will be able to show that this term will be much smaller than the previous term. So for most part, again, you can ignore lambda if you are going to study like collapse structures in the universe, like galaxies. And if you ignore lambda, you will find the equation which is r double dot equal to minus gm by r square. So mathematically, this is identical to a particle moving in a 1 by r square force field. So it is exactly, if you throw a stone upwards, the equation of motion satisfied by that stone will be same as the one which is satisfied by the spherical shells which are collapsing. Okay. So clearly, depending on the initial conditions, what will happen is r will increase just as the distance of the stone increases. It will reach a maximum. The velocity will become 0, and then it will come down the stone, which means r in this case will collapse to 0. Okay, and it will collapse to a point. Now, actually, this can, as you can see, this equation is so simple, you can solve everything analytically. And I'm not going to do that, but you can easily work this out. What I'm going to rather show are solutions to this equation after solving it. So what I have plotted here on the left-hand side is the radius versus scale factor. Scale factor is a proxy for time. Remember, the scale factor is such that it increases this way. Okay, so scale factor is small here. Scale factor increases to the other side. And just for specification, I'm talking about a region which is like 10 to the 9 H inverse solar mass. Okay, these are typical kind of regions which will collapse very early. And let us say it has collapsed at a redshift of 5. Okay, I've chosen the initial conditions such that this is what happens. Now, how does the radius behave? The radius increases, goes to a maximum, comes down. And if you look at the dotted part, that would be the solution to the spherical, that equations we wrote. it will eventually go to zero. I mean, going to zero means it's like a black hole. But in reality, that doesn't happen. What happens is, as this shell is collapsing, initially it may have very small tangential motions, okay, in addition to the radial motion. But initially you can ignore them. But as time grows, these tangential motions will also grow. And at some point, this spherical assumption will break down because everything is not moving radially. And then shells will start crossing each other. So the equations we wrote won't be valid, and the system will, what we call, it will go through a relaxation process. Okay, it will basically, there will be a lot of mixing happening. And that part is very nonlinear, not very easy to solve. But what we know is at the end, it will reach a stable equilibrium, what we call the virial equilibrium. And at that point, its properties are determined by the virial theorem. So in reality, what will happen is it won't go to zero. It will be given by the black line. It will follow the spherical solution to a large extent, but at some point, when the radius becomes too small, it will hit a kind of constant value, and the radius won't change after that because it has reached the equilibrium. In this case, in this place, it may not be so simple. It may go through some oscillations and various non-linearities, but at the end, it will become like stable. Okay, so the actual solution looks like this. This dashed line tells you where it will collapse. The red dotted line gives you what would have happened if it expanded like the Hubble flow. Okay, so if it had expanded like the Hubble flow, it would have kept on expanding. In fact, initially you see it was expanding like the Hubble flow. The red dot and the black solution are on top of each other. But at some point, the black solution deviates. Okay, so these are effects of density contrasts and peculiar velocities. Okay, it deviates from the Hubble flow. It still keeps on expanding, but at some point it stops expanding and then it contracts. Okay, so this is the solution to spherical collapse, and these are the kind of things we see all around us. Okay, we don't see spherical shells collapsing, but we see galaxies which are close to us coming towards us and so on. Okay. The right hand side shows the solution for the density contrast, okay, versus scale factor. So the density contrast, the actual density contrast, evolves like the black line. And by the time it collapses, you would see that this is a logarithmic plot. It will hit something very close to 100 or so. Okay, so the level hasn't come, but it is of the order of few hundreds. An interesting exercise is, suppose I say that, okay, forget the nonlinear, the actual solution. What would have happened to the density contrast if I had kept solving using linear theory? Okay, even when the linear theory is not valid, let me just solve it using linear theory. What would have happened is, initially the linear theory and the nonlinear theory will be overlapping because the density contrasts are small. You see, they are overlapping with each other. This is what we said. The true density contrast will be same as the linear density contrast as long as the density contrasts are small. But the time it becomes slightly more than 0.1 or so of the order of unity, these two curves start deviating. The linear density contrast does not like increase as fast as the true density contrast. And it takes us value which is much smaller. Okay, so this would have happened if I had solved it using linear theory.
So
now what I can do is,
hello.
Yeah.
So I have a small query.
Yes.
In this first figure, when the spherical collapse finally reaches the equilibrium portion, the virial equilibrium, you have talked about the shells, they start to overlap. So after the collapse stops, will there still be a spherical symmetry, or the spherical symmetry will get disrupted?
Yes. Yeah, that is interesting. So what happens is, to a very large extent, the spherical symmetry will be maintained. Spherical symmetry will be maintained in the sense, inside, if you think of it being made up of particles, all the particles are moving randomly in all directions, but there is no preferred directions. So can some both of you are speaking? So Anirban is asking a question. Let him speak. Zafri, can you mute yourself? Yeah. So I will come to you in just a moment. So what will happen is the spherical symmetry will be maintained in a statistical sense. The particles will be moving in random directions all over the place, but there won't be any specific direction. Okay. So it will approach what is called the virial equilibrium, where the kinetic energy and the potential energy will get related to each other in a very specific way. And it will attain a spherical symmetry to a very good approximation. But not that it won't be concentric shells, like, okay, it will be spherical in an average statistical sense. Okay.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, Zafri or someone who was asking a question, you can go ahead now. Okay, maybe not. Okay, maybe not.
Yeah, hello.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Actually, I got disconnected and then got reconnected and it was unmuted. So that's why.
Okay, okay. But did you have a question?
No, no.
Okay, okay. No problems at all. Please, yeah, it's fine. Okay. So then, suppose I want to solve it for different kind of masses, for different kind of redshifts. That is like changing the initial condition. Now, the black line is the previous solution I showed in the previous plot. Okay, it increases, comes down, and then attains equilibrium. Suppose I take the blue curve, which is like a mass which is higher, 10 to the 10 instead of 10 to the 9. The collapse redshift, let us say it is same. I have just kept it 0.1 difference just so that the curves are slightly different. But for our practical purposes, 5 and 5.1 are like same. You can think of it. Now, in that case, you see the initial radius. Okay, by the way, now the x-axis has also changed. Now I'm plotting 1 plus z, okay, instead of a. So initially also you see this mass will have a larger radius. It increases up to a larger radius and it also settles down at a radius which is larger. So clearly the radius of the region will be larger if the mass is larger. So that is something we learn from this solution. Suppose I take a different case where I take 10.9 like the first case, but I ask it to collapse at redshift 7. So in that case, initially they will be very similar, but later on what will happen is this will actually start collapsing earlier and collapse to a kind of smaller radius. Okay, so this is what happens if you take if you want it to collapse earlier. Now let us ask what happens to the density contrasts. Okay, and there are surprises. Firstly, let us look at the true density contrast. You will see that the true density contrast for all the cases, by the time they collapse, they're actually hitting the same value. They're collapsing at different times. Okay, so their x-axis position is different, but the y-axis position, that by the time they collapse, is exactly the same. So the density contrast they will achieve will be independent of the initial conditions. This is happening because of the symmetry in the problem. Various things get scaled out and you end up with a density contrast which is independent of everything else. It is independent of the mass, it is independent of when it is collapsing and so on. Okay, so that is interesting. Now let us ask what happens to the linear solution, and the linear solution is also very surprising. It is not accurate, of course, but what we see is by the time it collapses, the linear theory also hits the same value, no matter what initial conditions you started with. Okay, so this is very interesting. So that then tells us that there are, because of the symmetry now, we have a very good, there are some quantities which kind of tend to remain invariant as long as spherical symmetry is valid. So the summary of the results, which I just talked about, is that there is a spherical solution which can be solved. Of course, the spherical solution breaks down when non-radial motions become important and the system relaxes to a virial equilibrium. The true density contrast at collapse is what? It is 18 pi square minus 1. It's almost like a fundamental constant. Okay. And you can solve, you can show it. Okay. This, of course, if you ignore lambda, for lambda, there is a small correction on top of that. Okay. And this is independent of mass or collapse redshift. The linear density contrast at collapse is also something which can be written in terms of pi's and everything. It is 1.686, fixed value. Okay. So this is a very kind of nice feature of spherical symmetry. Okay. Now let us move to something else. I'm covering various things, but these are things which are important for studying the perturbed universe. And I'm just covering various things in just one lecture. So it's a bit dense. Till now, we have talked about like temporal aspect of the perturbations. How do they grow with time? What is the spatial distribution? Okay. Now, that is a slightly difficult problem. So suppose you think of any epoch t, okay, and I want to know the value of rho at all points x. But that is an impossible task. I mean, somebody has to give you the values at each point in space. I mean, it's like infinite number of field values. Now, if you look at the large scale distribution of galaxies as well as the CMB field, you don't see a very obvious pattern. Okay, I mean, there are filaments and sheets and so on, but things are still random. It's not like you see a very particular pattern. So the idea is one thinks that the cosmic density field is nothing but a random field which is generated by some stochastic process. So hence we should not try to study the field like in point to point. So there's no point in asking the question, what is the value of rho at that point? That doesn't have any fundamental significance. Okay. Rather, one should talk only about the statistical properties of the density field and the velocity field and so on. Okay. Because what we are observing is a specific realization of the underlying random field. That realization may not have any significance. Okay. It's only the statistics which are significant. The situation is very similar to, for example, statistical mechanics, where we are never interested in individual positions or momenta of particles. Okay, we will be only talking about distribution functions or average quantities like temperature and pressure. Okay? Nobody is going to tell us that I have a box with so many particles. What is the position of 107th particle at time 3.6 seconds? That question has no meaning in statistical mechanics. However, we'll be happy to know the distribution function at some time t, or the temperature, how it evolves, okay, and things like that. Okay, which kind of distributions are important, whether it is exchanging energy with the surroundings. So we are talking about statistical aspects. So similarly, in this case also, we'll be the ones which we'll be talking about are statistically average quantities, like ensemble averages, let us say. Okay. So you talk about mean, you talk about variance and various other things, which I will soon come to. Now, even if you want to do statistics for a general random field, it's not very easy to give you statistics. Okay. So for doing that, what you have to do is imagine that you have this universe, you have divided into n cells having positions x1, x2 to xn. And then in the continuum limit, we will take n going to infinity and cell volume will go to 0. Now, any random perturbation field will be characterized by a set of n numbers where n will go to infinity, because I want to have to specify it at every point in space. And if you want to specify the field in the statistical sense, you have to give the probability distribution function, the joint probability distribution function of all these n quantities, which also becomes impossible, because you have to specify infinite number of moments to do that. Now, fortunately, what happens is, if you look at the initial density field, which is linear, like in the CMB, it turns out that it is very well approximated by a Gaussian random field. So that this probability distribution function is actually a Gaussian. And Gaussian, the advantage is the Gaussian can always be characterized by a mean and a variance for one variable. If you have n variables, you have to give the 2-point correlation. So basically, the probability distribution function of n such numbers will be nothing but given by this, okay? Where this e to the minus half delta t m inverse delta is the Gaussian form, okay? It's actually will reduce to a delta square kind of a thing. And m is a matrix which gives you the correlation between two different points, okay? The mean will be 0 because the delta is defined in such a way that the mean has to go to 0. The 1-point distribution is just the simple Gaussian. So if you are interested in 1 point, the distribution is just Gaussian. If you are interested in, for example, a region, and you are interested in the density contrast in the region smoothed over it, that is also a Gaussian random field, okay? And the corresponding sigma can be worked out. You can also define something like a 2-point correlation function, which is what you take the density contrast at x1 and density contrast at x2, and you just do ensemble average of that. This actually measures the excess probability of finding any tracer over random at these volume elements. So if everything was distributed completely randomly, the 2-point correlation function would have been 0. And similarly, for a completely homogeneous universe, this quantity would have been 0, obvious. In our universe, because it is statistically homogeneous, psi x1 x2 becomes a function of psi x1 minus x2. So it doesn't matter where x1 and x2 are. It depends only on the difference of x1 minus x2. Okay, it's like it's invariant under translations kind of a thing. That is statistical homogeneity. Statistical isotropy will imply that it's a function of only mod of x1 minus x2. So actually things simplify quite a bit. For the 2-point correlation function, you can take a Fourier transform and get something which is like the power spectrum. This is called the power spectrum. The power spectrum can also be defined in terms of the Fourier transform of the density contrast. So you have the density contrast, you take Fourier transform, you will get delta k. You take 2 delta k's, okay, and multiply one by the complex conjugate of the other. You will find whatever is there is the whatever remains is the power spectrum pk. Okay, so all these things can be shown very nicely. And there is a Dirac delta function, so which means if k and k prime are different, then this quantity will go to 0. So different modes are statistically uncorrelated. And same, like because of statistical isotropy, p of k will depend only on the mod of k. Okay. One defines also something which is known as the dimensionless power spectrum, which is k cube p of k by 2 pi square. This is nothing but something which measures power content within logarithmic intervals in k. So often this quantity is a much easier quantity to deal with rather than the power spectrum. In fact, the power spectrum is something which can be observed in principle from CMB, from galaxy surveys and so on. So what has been shown here is the observation of power spectrum versus wave number k. Okay. So wave number k is measured in units of inverse of length. So when k increases, that means you are looking at smaller scales. When k decreases, you are looking at larger scales. So these are larger scales, these are smaller scales. These are points coming from different observations. Okay, you will see that at larger scales, that means small k, the observations are coming from CMB. Okay, so these are CMB observations. And at some point, these are basically different galaxy surveys. Okay, so here you see points coming from galaxy surveys, and then there are things called Lyman alpha fluorescence. And these are points, and the black one is the best fit lambda CDM prediction. And you can see it matches the data very well. That is why we have this standard model of cosmology or concordance models of cosmology. It agrees with a variety of observations very nicely. Okay, so that is something to keep in mind. So power spectrum turns out to be a very fundamental statistical quantity one wants to measure. Okay. The power spectrum essentially measures how much fluctuations you have at different scales. Okay. So if I ask you how much fluctuations you have at small scales, you will go and measure the power here. How much fluctuations you have at large scales, you will probably measure the power here, and so on. The shape of the power spectrum is basically determined by what is known as the transfer function. And that depends on how different K modes evolve. Okay. And so on. So again, unfortunately, I won't have time to go into how this form comes about, but it has to do with how the universe goes from the radiation dominated phase to matter dominated phase, and so on. Okay. Was there a question? Sorry. Okay, you can go ahead. The final thing I want to do is formation of halos. What are halos? Halos are, you remember all this spherical collapse we were doing? It collapses and virializes and becomes some object on its own, okay, which does not care about the expansion of the universe. It has become an isolated object. Those are, like, the fancy name of those are halos. Halos are important because the galaxies will eventually form inside these halos. Okay, galaxies cannot form in arbitrary regions. Okay, galaxies need high density, stable structures to form. Now, this collapse of these objects is a very nonlinear problem in general. You can only do it in spherical collapse, but it cannot be done analytically in general. However, we can get some insights, again using a very simple theoretical model, and that is from spherical approximation. So what we are kind of assuming is, let us assume all halos in the universe are spherical. Okay, it may not be the case. It will depend on the initial condition. But let us assume that. In that case, what do we know? We know something very fundamental. We know that the halo will collapse and become a virialized object when the corresponding linear density contrast becomes 1.686, in ignoring lambda, of course. This is something we just discussed for the spherical collapse. So given that, people thought that then what we can do is we can just go to the linear density field, forget non-linearities, evolve the density field using linear theory, even when it is not accurate. But then in that linear density field, find out regions which have values above 1.686. Those regions will actually correspond to halos. So I don't have to do any non-linear theory. I will just do linear theory, even when it is not accurate. And in the linear theory, I will find regions which have values above 1.686. We will call that halo. And it's as simple as that. So what you can do is, for example, you can ask, what is the mass, fraction of mass, which are residing in collapsed objects above some mass m? That will be nothing but you have all the probability distribution that is given by e to the minus delta square by 2 sigma square, Gaussian random field. Remember, linear field is Gaussian random field. And you integrate it from this delta critical 1.686 to infinity, because all regions above that will be in halos. And this integral will give you an error function, a complementary error function, because of this delta critical sitting here. What you can do is, this collapse fraction is nothing but the number of halos times mass of halos integrated over all masses. That is the collapse fraction. So what you can do is, you already have an expression for collapse fraction. You can differentiate it and get the expression for d and dm, which is the number of halos per unit volume, per unit mass range. And this is a very useful thing. So it is telling you at a given redshift how many halos you have, which have mass between, let us say, 10 to the 9 solar mass and 10 to the 9.1 solar mass, okay, in that m and m plus dm, or 10 to the 10 solar mass and 10 to the 10.1 solar mass, or whatever. You can ask all sorts of questions. So it will give you the mass function, okay, and it actually leads to something which has an exponential. Just give me a second. Sorry. Yeah. So you will end up with something like this. It's called the pressure sector mass function. And remember, I mean, this looks like a very toy model kind of a thing. You have assumed linear theory, you have assumed spherical collapse, but it captures the basics very nicely. Then what people did were, people went ahead and tried to make it more sophisticated. For example, the first thing people did was give up on spherical symmetry and go to something which is more like ellipsoids. Okay, that is the next thing you can do. And this leads to an improvement to this calculation, and it gives a better match with the full simulations. Okay, so that thing is called Shed-Thurman mass function. I haven't given the formula, but you can do it. It's slightly more complicated because of the ellipsoidal aspect. Now you have to think about 3-axis collapsing rather than one spherical region. But at the end, what I have shown here is the mass function. So dn d ln m. So I'm just calculating it in logarithmic intervals versus the mass. What is plotted here, these points with error bars, are basically what you get from a true simulation, a full n-body simulation. You go there and find the halos and plot it. The green curve is this Press-Schechter formula, okay, which was derived using a very simple model. But even that simple model, you see, it gets the shape fine. Okay, it doesn't get the details correct because you see it goes off from the simulation, the green curve. But for initial understanding, it is quite nice. You should agree to this, that even with the simple model, which can be worked out almost in a pen and paper, this is a very nice and a powerful way of getting these halos. The moment you go to ellipsoid, you see the match is really, really good. So this is something, this is nice. That the halos are very complicated structures, but the basics can still be understood to a very large extent. This can be understood from simple analytical models. Of course, nowadays people just go and do it in simulations, but then there are situations where you need help of this analytical models. Okay. So I will come to the end, and at the end, what I wanted to show is just a movie of the structures evolving. Okay, so this is a full n-body simulation, and you can see the redshift mentioned. And as the universe expands, you will see that from almost homogeneous structure, you will see that this cosmic web is developing. Okay, so the movie will loop and it will evolve. And in this, wherever you see these white points, those are the places where halos are forming. Okay, and you will see that the halos are also forming on these high density regions corresponding to these filaments and high like knots and sheets and so on. So that is why the large scale structure of galaxies show this very nice filamentary structure. Okay, so this is how the galaxies evolve. Of course, you will realize that I have stopped the movie at redshift 5 because whatever I'm going to teach you or discuss in the next lectures about 21 centimeter, these are the redshifts we'll be mostly interested in. Okay, but structure formation is going on till redshift 0, and there are a lot of things which are happening, except we won't discuss this in this class, in this set of lectures. So that basically brings to the end of the lecture. So basically the take-home messages are that the large-scale structure of the universe is very interesting, but it should be studied in terms of statistically average quantities like power spectrum and so on. Analytical modeling can be done, where you can use linear perturbation theory, spherical collapse, Lagrangian perturbation theory, and so on. But a full set of structures, if you want to study, you have to go to n-body simulations. So I will stop here, and if there are further questions, I can take. Okay, I can go to the chat box, I guess, because your voice is still breaking. So Tausif is asking in the previous plot, why is it called instability? I assume you're talking about the gravitational instability. There will be some point where overdense regions reach some saturation. Clearly, overdense regions do reach some saturation, as we saw in the spherical collapse part. It reaches some kind of equilibrium position. It's called instability because imagine you have a completely uniform field. You just by some hook or crook introduce a small perturbation. Okay, it can be as small as you want. The moment you introduce that small perturbations, that perturbation's nature is that it will grow. It won't die down. It will grow because of gravity. So if you put a region slightly overdense, that overdensity will keep on growing. So that is why it's called instability. A stable system would have been one where you introduce a perturbation and it tends to go back to the original position. But here it is trying to go away from the original position. So it's called instability. Okay. Are these filaments galaxy or cluster? So it depends. Okay. The filaments can be galaxies, the filaments can be clusters. But clusters you will tend to find in rather more high density regions. Okay. Why are the blue and black lines so different? Blue and black lines so different. I'm assuming you're talking about the spherical collapse. So blue and black line are different because the masses are very different. So if you see the mass, if you see the masses are very different. 10 to the 9 and 10 to the 10. So that is why the difference is coming. Somebody, Anubhav Banerjee, is asking what will be the role of radiation in the overdense region. So no, it won't. So there are two aspects to it. First of all, if you are thinking about the cosmic radiation, which plays a very important role in CMB and early part, you know that after the universe enters a matter-dominated phase, this radiation becomes completely subdominant. Okay, its density is so low, it doesn't play any role in structure formation. The radiation which can play in galaxy formation is the radiation which is arising from within the galaxies. Okay, so within the from the gas which is falling inside these halos and will eventually form stars. That radiation will play a role in structure formation, but not. Yeah. So if you are asking about the radiation within the galaxy, that is something I will talk a bit more about in the next lecture. Okay, so that radiation will introduce pressure, it will affect the cooling of the gas and hence the structures, but it's a very complicated process. Okay, somebody is asking what factors does the Z collapse depend? No, Z collapse won't depend on the mass. What will happen is you will choose an initial condition, and depending on the initial condition, it will enclose a mass and it will collapse at some point. Okay, so these two can be independent. You can choose an initial condition such that the enclosed mass is 10 to the 10 solar mass, but it will collapse at redshift 3. You can choose another initial condition that the enclosed mass still remains 10 to the 10, but it can collapse at redshift 7. Or you can choose another initial condition that the enclosed mass goes to 10 to the 8 solar mass, but it collapses at some other redshift. Okay, so it all depends on how you choose the initial condition. Okay, so it's not like all masses of 10 to the 10 will collapse at the same redshift. That cannot happen. Okay. You wanted to ask how do you do n-body simulations, and for n-body simulation there are many publicly available n-body simulation codes. So the one I have used here is called Gadget. Okay, so go to the web, Google and search for Gadget 2. It's written by a person called Springle, and this is a publicly available code. You should be able to download, install, and run. Okay, you may not be able to run a very detailed box as this, but you will be able to run very small, low resolution box on your laptop. Okay, so nowadays it's possible to run things on your laptop. In my tutorials, I may not be able to show you n-body simulation, but what I will show you are things. So I won't be able to show you n-body simulation. I will be able to show you results coming from 2LPT, okay, which is an approximation to n-body simulation. So we will run a 2LPT code in our hands-on session. That will be on Saturday. Okay, so you should be able to see some of these structures yourself after running it on whatever thing which we are going to use. But that you can think of as proxy for n-body simulation for the time being. Okay. Rumela Kaur is asking that you said both dark matter and baryons are treated as fluids. what will be the difference between dark matter or baryons? If you're asking, what will happen is baryons will interact with radiation and hence there will be pressure. Or baryons will also collide with each other, which is essentially that collisions. You can think of them as electromagnetic interactions, of course. Dark matter, for all practical purposes, we think that their interactions are very weak, so they are like collisionless. Okay, so baryons will have pressure because of these interactions. Dark matter won't have pressure. Okay. So is there any way, any circumstances to collapse to black hole or avoid virializations for spherical collapse method? No, I mean, in general things there will be randomness and you will form these structures. Of course, in a small region, things may collapse. Okay, and that will depend on the details. So that is why we have, for example, black holes in the center of our galaxies. Okay, so, but that is a different physics. That is happening at much different scales compared to the scales we are talking about. Similarly, stars can collapse to black holes when their lifetime ends, like massive stars. That also is happening at stellar scales, not at the scales we are talking about. At these scales, we don't see like a full halo collapsing to a black hole. We haven't seen such black holes as yet. Okay, so no. How much computationally expensive would those n-body simulations be as a factor of spatial resolution? So I don't understand this question very well. So what you can definitely do, so you can, okay, so I can tell you the crucial factor is the RAM, the memory of your machine. And the resolution itself does not is not a very well-defined quantity. What matters is how many particles, how many fluid elements are you going to work with. Okay, so with those many fluid elements, if you take a total volume which is small, that will give you a reasonably high resolution. With those many fluid elements, if you take a total volume which is large, that will give you a very bad resolution. If you want a very large box with very high resolution, you have to increase the number of fluid elements or particles. Okay. Now you typically need like something like 100 bytes per particle. Okay. So on your laptop, you will be very easily be able to run 128 cube or 256 cube particle boxes. Okay, that will be easy to run. In fact, in our tutorial, we will do a 12 PT, but we will do something like a 128 cube run. But even in those tutorials, we'll be able to do 256 cube runs very easily. Okay, so that is one way of looking at it. So that is the total number of particles you are dealing with. Currently, cutting edge n-body simulations, for example, the simulation I last showed you was run using 1024 cube particles. And the cutting edge ones are either 204x48 cube or 4096 cube. I mean, these are really, really huge simulations which are run in unit clusters, high performance clusters to run them. Okay, somebody said sharing slides. I think the recording will be available somewhere. And I can check with the organizers if they can share the slide in some way. Okay, I have no problem. Okay, any other questions you can ask directly here? Okay, somebody's voice was breaking again, but yeah, if anybody has a question, please go ahead. Okay, thanks. Any other question? Okay, okay, I don't know. I mean, I think you can ask questions on the Slack channel, I think. I mean, I may not be like checking it every minute, but once in a while I will check the Slack channel. And if you just mark, if you are asking a question to me, just mark me. Then I will try to answer it easily if you have any questions. Otherwise, what will happen is we will see you on Saturday morning. Okay, so Saturday I have 2 lectures, 2 slots. Morning we will take the lecture, and in the afternoon there will be a hands-on session. Somebody has asked whether the critical density contrast will change for WDM CDM model. So what we showed is the CDM model. For WDM, yes, it will change. WDM, many things will change. No, the critical. Yes, the critical density will change. The critical thing will change also for lambda CDM model as well. Okay, but for WDM, many other things will change more than the critical density. So that is something to worry more about it. Okay, many of these things which I talked about will change in WDM. Halos won't form the way I told. WDM is a very different kind of beast. Any other questions? I can wait for some more time, or maybe not. If there are no further questions, maybe we can wrap up this session then.
Okay, so thank you very much, Tit, for a nice introduction to perturbation theory. And thanks to all the participants. We had a very lively discussion session. As Tit suggests, if you have some more questions, you can ask in the Slack channel as well. And also just to assure you that, the recordings are being done and they will be shared with all the participants at the end of this program. But for that, you need to take part in all the sessions and be there for sure. So don't just expect that you won't be here and you will just be shared with the recordings. Okay. So once again, thank you, Tit. So we'll be happy to have you here once again on Saturday. And so we wish you a very nice lunch time. Albeit this will be virtually. And so all of us, the participants and the next of the speaker will be Tuhin Ghosh, who will be once again joining here at 2:20. Okay, thank you all.